Hello and welcome to Problem Solving with the Pre-1850 Census, Investigating the Tick Marks, Part 1. My name is Diana Elder and I'm an accredited genealogist. You can see more about me at FamilyLocket.com. My contact information is Diana at FamilyLocket.com, and if you're interested, you can listen to my podcast, the Research Like a Pro Genealogy Podcast. The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong solely to the creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of FamilySearch International and Roots Tech. To get started, let's have an overview. This is the first of two parts, and in part one, we're going to talk about the challenges of the pre-1850 U.S. Census research. We're going to introduce the case study and the research process. I'm going to talk about how the census came to be, what is found in the census from 1790 to 1840, and then tips for searching and using the pre-1850 census records. In part two, we are going to go through a case study showing how I used the 1850 census records and before to solve a tricky brick wall problem. And I will be showing how those tips for searching and use the pre-1850 census records make sense in a real-world example. Let's talk challenges. In the pre-1850 census research, first of all, we have a loss of some of the census schedules. Some of the early censuses simply did not get recopied and sent on to Washington, D.C. or to the state. They were lost, and there's nothing we can do about that. We can substitute other records, but sometimes we just have to do our best with what survives. Another challenge is, before 1850, only the head of household is named, and everyone else is a tick mark. And beyond that, they're not even given a real date of birth or a real age, they're given a date range. And so we have some challenges with just figuring out who is who in the household. Then we have men of the same name. If you have 10 Benjamin Cox men in one state, how are you supposed to know who is who when you have no other identifying information such as a wife's name or a child's name? Well, we're going to talk about some strategies to take care of that. And then we have boundary changes. Did you know that your ancestor could have lived in the same place and had the county boundary changes around him make it seem like he had moved with every census year? So it's important to look at that. These are some of the challenges, and I'm going to show you how to get around some of those. Let me introduce the case study. Even though we won't be studying it in part one, I want you to know what we'll be talking about in part two. So here's my research conundrum, and maybe you have something very similar to this. Who was the father of Rachel Cox, who was born about 1828 in Indiana and died between 1870 and 1880 in Falls County, Texas? Rachel married Hickman Monroe Schultz on 4 July 1848 in Navarro County, Texas. And this image shows just a little bit of her marriage record. So maybe you have an ancestress like this, Rachel Cox, who was born and is not listed on a census with her birth family. She's first listed by name in the marriage record of, or in the census of her husband after 1850 or 1850, possibly being the first record of her. And so that is my case. And do you think Cox is kind of a common name? Yes. So we have the problem of a common name, and we also have the problem of just early records. This family was in Texas in the 1850s, which is early, and same with Indiana. 1828 in Indiana was early, and so we have some typical problems here of early 1800 census or early 1800 record research. I like to teach how to research using a process. And I have found that the following process greatly aids me in my work with my own family and also as a professional genealogist. And so this is what I do. when I'm researching. I set a specific focused objective and one that I know that will help guide my research instead of jumping around from website to website. I do a timeline analysis of all that has been found on the individual or the family to that point. Then I study the location and learn about the records and everything that could help me in making new discoveries. Based on all of the information from the timeline and the locality research, I make a plan. And then I know where I'm going. I have a roadmap for future research. And as I'm researching, I keep track of everything I'm searching in a research log and create source citations. So I know where I've been, where I've documented things, and I can find that record again. And then finally, I write up my conclusions so I don't forget what I figured out. When we are working in research before 1850, it's complicated, and we are often using indirect evidence. We're using clues from the records. We need to bring them all together to be able to really prove anything and to show someone else how we came to our conclusions. So that is my research process. I'll be touching on different parts of this throughout this series. First of all, though, we really need to talk about the census. What are the United States Census records and how did they come to be? Well, a count of the population was used to decide how many representatives each state was allowed and taxation. And so, of course, the new United States government needed money. They needed to find a way to take care of things, and they needed some tax money. And so how were they to know unless they knew how many people were living in each area, how much tax they could require from the local governments and the state governments? So they set a law out that a census was to be taken every 10 years from 1790 on. As each 10-year period went by and a new census was going to be taken, the federal government added questions depending on what it wanted to know about its citizens. And we're going to go through in some detail some of those questions before 1850. But it's interesting to look at the censuses after 1850, even though we won't discuss that in this presentation, and see all the different questions and think about why the government wanted to know things such as, do you have a radio in your home? Or when did you immigrate to the United States? So many interesting questions and details we can find out about our ancestors as we search the census. And remember that a census record is truly a snapshot of a household at that moment in time. We are just looking at that specific time period. Where can you access the United States Census records? Luckily for us, the records have been digitized and they are available on so many websites. FamilySearch.org has those, and that's a free website. Its partner websites, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Find My Past, also have the censuses. And those are paid websites, so if you don't want to have a subscription, you can simply access the census on FamilySearch. One of the clues to census research is if you are not finding your ancestor, try another website, because each is independently indexed, and it's just quite possible that the surname is spelled a little bit tricky and maybe a different indexer index it differently, or maybe that website's algorithm is set up differently, and so whatever you put in will pull up the census depending on how it's been indexed. So here's a huge tip. Always look at the actual image of the census. Even if it's indexed well and has the names of all the people, or has whether they're female and their age range as in pre-1850 censuses, always look at the original. See if you agree. See if the headings match up with what's been identified in the index, and especially look at the names. Once you can decipher a name, or often you can decipher a name more accurately because you know it's your family. 1790 to the 1840 censuses. This is what it looks like. We have got head of households on the left, and then we have got a bunch of tick marks and numbers representing our household. This is kind of one of the conundrums of this type of research, that we only have the head of household. But we do have some strategies that we can use to figure out who is who and to get some clues about these families, even though we don't have names of anyone other than the head of household. And note that we do have occasions where a female was the head of household, if she were a widow, and she'll be named. In this example, it looks like we only have initials of the first, instead of a first name for the head of household. And so if you see that, you're going to have to combine with other research to determine if this was a male or female as the head of household, because it can be a little bit more difficult to determine. So 1790 to 1840 censuses. Carefully analyzing the household can give good clues to the makeup of the family, even though individuals were not named. Key to this kind of research is combining these censuses with other records, and that is key in all of our research, but especially with these records, we have to combine. Now, in the early census years, we don't have that specific standardized paper to keep all the records on. Instead, census takers were just to use whatever they could find. And so you'll see a variety of writing. And here's one that's very clearly handwritten. At the top are all the different column headings, and then down the sides are the different people. You always want to look at your original to see what you can find. In one of the originals that I was searching for the 1790 census, the census taker had noted that there were several men of the same name on the census and had made some notations to the side talking about which was which, son of or junior, senior, and so that gave me some clues as to how to identify the actual people. So what is in the 1790 to 1840 census records? Well, as we've talked about quite a bit, we have the name of the family head. And then we have the first grouping is free white males and in various age groups. And this changes from census year to census year for the most part. The syllabus that I've provided for you has the specifics. So always be careful to see exactly what that year was taking down as the ages. And then we also have the grouping of free white females in those various age groups. And again, make sure that you're paying close attention to how they are divided. Those ages are divided. We have the number of enslaved individuals. They are listed by gender and age beginning in 1820. Before that, it was just the number. So if you are doing African American research, this can be helpful if you have traced a slave owner and you're using other records such as probate or perhaps tax records and trying to see if an enslaved ancestor was in this household. You can sometimes put that together by looking at the gender and the ages. Then in 1820 and in 1830, we have the number of foreigners not naturalized in a household. And so if you have an immigrant ancestor that immigrated before those years and they have not naturalized, they might show up as a notation in that column. And then you'll know that you can look for naturalization records after those dates. So we also have in 1840 some military information for the first time. This was the year that Congress decided they needed to know how many military pensioners that they had in the country because they were going to start paying a Revolutionary War pension. And that also covered, of course, the War of 1812 and some of the other wars that had taken place up to 1840. And so if your ancestor has a notation there or is named there, then you'll know that you've got some military records that you can go and look at. Now, census search tips. What can help you in this search? Well, here's something that you may not have thought of, but as we all know, the census takers didn't always know how to spell our ancestor surnames. Our ancestors didn't always know how to spell their surnames. So as you find different spellings for your surname, keep a list. And then you can go through that list as you're doing your search. Some algorithms will pick up the R or the B, but some may not. So in this example, you see all the different ways that I have found Royston, one of my surnames, spelled with a B, with an R, with an O-N, an E-N, an E-R, R-O-I, B-O-I, and there's probably even more variations of this surname. You might have a surname that could have 10 or 20 variations. So keep a list of those, and then as you're doing your census searches, you can try all those out. Now, another fun way that you can do your searching is using wildcards. You can use an asterisk that matches 0 or more characters, such as ROYST asterisk, and then that would pick up anything such as the EN, IN, ON, UN, or you could use an asterisk at the beginning, and that would catch all the R's or the P's or the B's. So that can be a great trick to help you in figuring out if another way to search to make it easier. When all else fails, if you know your ancestor just has to be in an area because they've lived there forever and they didn't move and you just know they're there, sometimes you have to search all the images for the area to find your ancestor. It can be really difficult if the handwriting was bad or perhaps that page was damaged somehow and the writing is very, very light and difficult to read. But you know who you're looking for, and so your eyes can sometimes make out the letters when an indexer who's unfamiliar with your family or your ancestor just has no idea what they're looking at. If you're trying to interpret handwriting, look for the same letter somewhere else on the page. For instance, if you're looking at a letter and you're not sure if it's an S or an L, try looking for a Smith somewhere on that page or maybe the page before or after and see how that census taker or whoever's writing was making their S's. So that's a trick to try to figure out something that's more common and see if you can see how the letters were being formed. As I said earlier, I'm just going to reiterate again, always look at the image. Just the basic information on the census is indexed, and granted pre-1850 there's not a lot of extra information besides the tick marks that show the gender and the age, but occasionally there is extra information. Some of the censuses noted occupation, whether they were in agriculture or in manufacturing, and that can make a big difference if you are tracing an ancestor who was a farmer and there's another man of the same name who was in manufacturing. Then you would know which was yours and which was the other John Smith, so to say. Another trick is to search for all the censuses in an individual's life. You will want to try to track them down in every census. And if it's pre-1850, it could be that you're looking for them in a census where they're a child in their parents' household and they will not be named. They will simply be a tick mark. But it's still important to try to understand the family and decide if that's perhaps them in that household. For one thing, that will help to link your ancestor back to the parents, and as you put that together with other records and other evidence, you can come to a pretty good conclusion about where your ancestor was at that time period. Something to remember, and that is so important in this type of research, is that census records lead to other records. As you are doing your census research, keep notes of what other records you could search for information. Think about something, for instance, if you found that military mention of an ancestor, that would lead you to military records. And if you found perhaps that your ancestor was marked in the column of working in agriculture, that could lead you to land records. If your ancestor was 45 plus in 1820, maybe you could start looking for probate records if he died after that. And so think about what other records could be there for you to make more discoveries. For more helps on the census, I've written several articles, and you can find these on my website, FamilyLocket.com, and I also have 2 podcasts on our Research Like a Pro genealogy podcast on the census. So if you're interested in learning more, getting more examples, I invite you to go check that out. Here's an example of what our podcast looks like on the website and on podcast apps. And we have a dedicated page. Just go to familylocket.com/rootstech, and there you will get templates and information all about our offerings. So I invite you to go check it out, and please be sure and watch part 2 of this series. I invite you to watch other great videos on RootsTech Connect. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in part 2.